Russia is trying to take us back in time, but those who have struggled to be free will not accept the bondages of an uglier past. The European Union and our member states have already supported Ukraine with almost 20 billion euros.
Yeah, it was at that defense meeting in Lithuania this morning that Ukrainian President Zelensky asked European nations to stand together on the issue of imposing a price cap on Russian oil. So far, EU members have failed to agree on a cap. Zelensky also said that his people, quote, must endure this winter. His comments come as Ukraine works to restore power across the country after Russia targeted critical infrastructure in a series of attacks. Joining me now to talk more about the war in Ukraine, retired US Army Major General William Enyart. It's great to see you, General. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, Nasha. Good to be with you.
So talk to us about the energy situation in Ukraine and the rest of Europe right now. Do you agree with Zelensky that European nations need to establish a price cap on Russian oil?
Well, I think they do. I think that would be difficult to enforce, but it certainly would be one more step in the sanctions that have been built around Russia. We need to remember that in Ukraine, 50% of Ukrainian energy electricity comes from nuclear power. So that's the world's highest percentage in terms of the power developed from nuclear power. So it's very concerning about these Russian attacks on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure due to the likelihood of a nuclear disaster.
Well, and Lithuania is a former Soviet state and now NATO member. It is expressing concern as well about the 8,500 Russian troops currently in Belarus. What are you monitoring there? What should we be looking out for there?
Well, that's right, Natasha. I think the thing we need to remember there is that Lukashenko, the Belarusian dictator, essentially, he's a president, but his election is widely regarded as being entirely dishonest. Is not popular with the Belarusian people, and he is Putin's only ally on his western flank. Lukashenko allowed the Russians to move 100,000 troops through Belarus to attack Kyiv, but Lukashenko did not get involved in that attack. He didn't allow them to use any of his troops or his air power. So I suspect that these 8,500 troops are simply there to prop up Lukashenko rather than to be used in another attack on Kyiv or northern Ukraine, or for that matter, on Lithuania. I think Lukashenko would be very reluctant to allow the Russians to attack a NATO nation moving across his territory. That would make him complicit in an attack on a NATO nation, and I don't think he wants to be in that position. If the Russians couldn't conquer Ukraine with 100,000 troops coming in from Belarus, they're certainly not going to be able to with 8,500, even if they're allied with the 50,000 or so Belarusians who are very poorly led, poorly equipped, and poorly trained.
Yeah, I appreciate the context. And meanwhile, today, the NATO chief vowed unwavering support for Ukraine. And his comments come one day after President Biden spoke about the need to keep providing aid to Ukraine. In your eyes, what do the Ukrainians need right now?
Well, I think critically right now, they need two things. Number one, they need anti-air capabilities, more anti-air capabilities. We've delivered anti-air capabilities to them, but a lot of their current anti-air capability is comprised of S-300s, Soviet anti-aircraft missiles that were designed back in the 70s. It's half-century-old technology. Luckily, though, the Russians, the bulk of the Russian attack now is coming from S-300s. So as Ukraine adds more technologically advanced anti-air capability from NATO and the U.S., they're going to have even greater success in shooting down these Russian S-300s.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.